Good morning, welcome to Insiders. The federal government is about to intervene in Aboriginal communities in a way thought unimaginable just a few years ago. Any one of the many initiatives would make front page news on their own. A ban on alcohol, the scrapping of the permit system, conditional welfare, compulsory health checks for kids. Those actions have been described as radical, draconian, paternalistic and above all, necessary. The government has won widespread support for its declaration of a national emergency because they are finally dealing with a national disgrace, the sexual abuse of children fuelled by alcohol. And the Prime Minister is ready for the critics who sense political expediency in an election year.
Well, the reason we're doing it is genuine. That's my response. I mean, it would be a failure of leadership on my part. I mean, in the end, what greater responsibility do you have than the care of children who are vulnerable? And frankly, people can make allegations. I don't care. But we have done it for genuine reasons. And let me say, I've not chaired a more passionate and committed cabinet meeting than the one I chaired today, which finalised our decision.
And Kevin Rudd has guaranteed political bipartisanship.
If you go through this report, it becomes necessary for the Australian community to act and to put politics to one side. The truth is, no side of politics has had a magic solution on this challenge. And the truth is, we now have a proposal for a new direction in action, and I'm prepared to give that a go.
On the program this morning, the Federal Minister who drove the initiative, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Brough. And then later on in the program, the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, Clare Martin. All that coming up, but first for the latest news headlines overnight, it's Good Morning, Katrina Blowers.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning. The Prime Minister has rejected criticism of his radical plan to curb Indigenous child sexual abuse, saying the old approach has failed. Mr Howard says the biggest problem is that women and children in those communities are scared to death of speaking up.
Unless you get police on the ground, unless you establish the atmosphere of physical security or a greater atmosphere of physical security, nothing is going to change.
He says the problem will not be solved in a matter of months, but this at least provides a start. The President of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, has accused foreign troops of killing more than 50 civilians in what he describes as indiscriminate military operations. Most of the deaths happened when NATO-led forces clashed with a large group of insurgents near the Pakistan border. Mr Karzai said coalition forces were being careless and called for greater coordination before such attacks were launched. The outgoing British Prime Minister Tony Blair has met Pope Benedict in a private audience at the Vatican, heightening speculation he may convert to Catholicism. The meeting with the Pontiff comes 4 days before Mr Blair leaves office. The British press is tipping that the two discuss the possibility of his conversion. Mr Blair's wife and children are Catholic and he regularly attends Catholic Mass with his family. Barry, I'll be back with another news update at 11 o'clock.
Katrina, thank you. And we'll go straight to our program guest now, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Brough, who along with the Prime Minister announced the radical federal government response to child sex abuse in Aboriginal communities. Brough joins us this morning from Sydney. Minister, good morning, welcome.
Thanks, Barry, good to be with you.
How quickly do you plan to move on this in an operational sense?
Well, I've had preliminary talks with Defence because they are the ones that will provide the logistical support for our police that will be coming out on the ground or being deployed on the ground. AFP, New South Wales and Victorian Police have already committed a minimum of 10 troops, but the military will be paramount to be able to provide the communications and the logistics support such as vehicles. They will be ready to move, the first elements of those, early next week, so from tomorrow, so within a couple of days from there. The AFP will be in the Northern Territory on Monday doing a scoping work with their NT counterparts, and from there I expect to have troops deployed with the military deployed with the police within about a week's time.
And where will this activity happen tomorrow?
Well, look, Murderjulu has, of course, been something of a hotspot, and we built a police station there with federal government money, and then only to find that it wasn't occupied.
You
may have seen in the Late Line program last week a caller from Murderjulu saying that after the federal government, ORAC, lost its appeal in the courts about having an administrator, that elements were back, drinking, breaking into houses, threatening people again. So I want to have some sort of support for those people in Mutijulu as early as Monday or Tuesday of next week. I don't think it's feasible that I'll be able to have a police presence, a sworn police presence there, but showing that we care and that we support them, and knowing that the police are only a matter of days away, will send a clear message to those elements that want to disrupt that community again. It is a scared community, and it's one that deserves our support.
Well, given that you feel there's a sense of urgency there, I guess you'll learn something right off the bat, depending on how it all goes there.
Well, that's right, and the difference there is we actually have a police station with accommodation and communications ready to go, but of course since we opened that police station it has not had an adequate police presence, and quite often it's been closed. So it sort of was almost living a lie for the people of Mutijulu to put this bright, shiny new police station but not give them the human element that actually gave them the protection. So they know now that we are serious, and that's the starting point. But we have a lot of area to cover. I have a meeting this morning with senior bureaucrats, including Head of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Dr Gerard, here in Sydney, and we'll be fleshing out in great detail what we need to do, the first steps, which are all about stabilising these communities.
And of course the task group that will help oversee this, the magistrate Sue Gordon is on it. Who else will be part of that?
Well, over the weekend I've been contacting a number of people, and I can announce this morning that we have two very key people coming on board. Former Assistant Commissioner of AFP, Shane Castles, he's just recently retired. He was the Commissioner in the Solomon Islands for 2 years. He set up the international deployment forces for police. He's a man of great experience, great understanding of these sort of issues. He's agreed to be on the task group and will have a key role. And former AMA President, Dr Bill Glasson, and we all understand, and we've heard a fair bit of commentary about the issue of health checks. He also has agreed to come on board, and his assistance will be invaluable.
Now, what about your own Indigenous advisory group, though? They didn't seem to have been involved in this in the run-up to it. Are they going to be involved from now on?
They were fully briefed at the same time that we were doing announcing this. Sue Gordon I had briefed previously and taken her advice, and clearly they will be. I've also been in discussions since with Noel Pearson, and we will continue to deal with people, but people shouldn't get hung up about leaders that are a long way away from what's occurring on the ground. What we need to do here is to assure and reassure and engage with people on the ground who are living these circumstances today, and you only do that with face-to-face contact. That means us having managers on the ground working with Indigenous communities and with the NT.
But quite apart from bringing those communities into it, you're obviously trying to build a bipartisan response to all of this. Would it have helped if you had drawn the federal opposition into it earlier? The first that they knew of this was when they were watching your news conference.
No, I don't believe so. I mean, we are charged with being responsible for this nation as the government of the day and the executive. We actually received this report officially only minutes before we made our announcements, and of course we pulled it down off the net on the Friday. Literally myself and the senior bureaucrats and my staff worked day and night to pull together this initiative. I think that if we'd gone further afield, what we would have ended up with is a lot of speculation, scaremongering, and potentially not the magnitude of response that we've been able to achieve here.
But what about the Northern Territory government? Obviously you were disappointed that they hadn't responded to the report, but why didn't you go to them and say, OK, this is what we have in mind, are you in or out?
Well, we tried to contact the Chief Minister, both my office and the Prime Minister,
well, there was only
before
the one
announcement.
Attempt, I think.
That was unsuccessful. But let's just be realistic about this. When I raised these issues more than 12 months ago, I was said in the media by the Chief Minister and her other ministers that I was grandstanding, that put up or shut up. There's two comments that come to mind. They reluctantly came to our summit. They refused to provide even the most minor detail about the disposition of their police numbers, which was for our independent police investigation run by Mr Valentine. And all of those things could have helped, and it would have shown that the NT was serious about this. I don't believe they really accepted the depth and the breadth of this problem. Today they do, and I'm only too willing to work with the Chief Minister and all of her ministers, and we have a hook-up tomorrow morning with 3 of them.
But they did commission this report after all, and in some of the correspondence that's gone backwards and forwards between your office and the Northern Territory Government, it's pretty clear that they actually support a lot of these initiatives.
Well, they do now, that's right. But let's just go back a little way. 15 months ago, there were 2 police in Wadeye, and the Chief Minister stood next to me in a press conference and said that's quite adequate. At the time, there were 300 people rioting, 25 houses destroyed, a man had been speared in the leg, and that was ongoing. Today, Wadeye is a much safer, more secure, happier community. Has a long way to go, and that was done without some of these other initiatives such as the welfare reform that we're going to be bringing in place. In Galawinku, I was told when I first came on board that in Galawinku there was no need for police, it was a safe community. A community of 3,000 people, Barry, with not one policeman. Today the NT says it's their highest priority, and the Commonwealth Government will pay for a police station, 3 police houses and a police launch. That's the sort of distance we've come, but quite frankly it was at a snail's pace. If you're really going to make a difference for those children on the ground. Those children may be getting helped in those 2 communities, but we're talking about at least another 60 communities. How long would it have taken for us to roll out the initiatives necessary to make a difference in their lives and protect them?
Let's go through some of the practicalities of it all now. We'll start with the ban on alcohol. Is there a danger, and Peter Beattie has pointed to this, that they will simply move on to Alice Springs or Darwin as they did in Cairns when a similar situation was introduced in Queensland?
Well, Peter Beattie's got it wrong on 2 accounts. One, that he has been sort of long and loud saying this is 6 months, it's just to get you past an election. Our commitment is to make these commitments, these legislative changes, for a period of 6 months or until such times as the NT government can demonstrate that they are actually stopping the rivers of grog. So not just laws, because they have laws in some of these places, but actually having them policed. Secondly, he's right that people can move. But we're also, by restricting the amount of cash available, that effectively restricts people's capacity to buy alcohol and to buy drugs. And finally, the flaw in the far north Queensland with his alcohol management plans is that you can drive down to Cairns or Cooktown, put a pallet of alcohol on the back of your ute, not show any identification, and drive straight back to the Cape. That's exactly what happens. And that's why we've had this implemented entirely across the entire area of the NT.
The permit system now, some communities fear that with this free access to a lot of these towns, they'll bring with them a fresh amount of problems.
Well, I mean, that is just absolute garbage. And let me just tell you what actually happened during the consultation. People were sitting around being told in public that the permit system needs to stay. And, you know, the notes were taken. At the conclusion of those meetings, not on one occasion, but on numerous occasions, the same people would come up to the people doing the consultation and say, look, I can't say this publicly, but privately, this thing's got to go. The reason it's got to go is because there's too much fear and intimidation here, and the permit system is aiding that. And in one community, it was made very clear that, in fact, the white workers, the teachers and the doctors, etc., felt so intimidated that if they spoke up, they would be removed or their right to a permit would be removed. Now, even if it's not possible, because teachers don't require permits, it's the fear factor. So if you've had pedophiles, alcohol, petrol sniffing and drugs running in with a permit system, and that has been the only protection instead of police, isn't it time that we actually protected those children with real police forces rather than an inadequate piece of paper?
And on the quarantining of the welfare, the 50% quarantining for essentials, you're thinking about applying that across the board?
Well, the Prime Minister has made it clear that I'll be back in Cabinet in a couple of weeks. On another morning program on a Sunday about 15 months ago, I flagged this idea that I felt that any parent throughout this nation that is abusing their children, neglecting their child, by not using the financial assistance that the taxpayer provides to benefit that child, well, we should be looking after the child's interest. If it's going on drugs, alcohol or gambling, then that's inappropriate. So I have been working with the state governments on a range of issues to do with school attendance, as well as those that have been in contact with their child protection agencies. And I'll be taking some of these issues to Cabinet in less than a fortnight.
But isn't that a problem here, though, whether it's in a black or a white community, that if people turn up with food stamps, they might as well have branded all over them, irresponsible parent?
Well, if they're irresponsible parent, what's more important, the child or the parent's state of mind? If you aren't actually providing food and a housing and clothing for your child, but not quite seriously enough for the state government's child protection services to remove you, shouldn't we do all we can? And just on the stigma issue, if you go to America, even age pensioners over there actually have food stamps as they're known, but they are in fact an electronic FPOS system which has no stigma attached to it. It only allows those people with that sort of income support to have those items paid for by the welfare. Now, I am not suggesting this for age pensioners. I don't want anyone to read that into it. It is for parents that are doing the wrong thing by their children, and we have a responsibility to do what we can to give those kids a better chance.
And on the compulsory health examinations for kids under 16, what do you do if the parents refuse? Because presumably these examinations will be quite invasive.
Well, look, the first thing is, Barry, a lot of people seem to have been pointing to that these are somehow just genitalia type examinations. That is wrong. The AMA has stated for a long time that there needs to be a much greater emphasis on health and well-being of Indigenous people. It starts with the children. It starts with knowing their entire health needs. So this is a health check for children across the board per se. Now, why would people refuse to have their ear, nose and throat checked, their heart and their well-being, all of the other issues that go with good health? They'd only do that if they're intimidated, if they're concerned about what might come up. So we will not be doing these checks until such times as we have secured the environment, people feel confidence that there's not going to be retribution if their child actually participates in a check. And we'll be very conscious of the issues of culture and the other issues associated with obviously any medical intervention.
Now, the Catholic Bishop of Darwin, Ted Collins, has said overnight, don't go into this with a bully boy attitude. What would your response be?
I agree with him entirely. And you know, some people have tried to paint this as a bully boy. A bully boy is a standover merchant, not someone that stands by you and protects you and looks out for your child. And what I'm looking for here is a group of people, some whom will be volunteers, who will actually work to help their fellow Australians to actually get out of the circumstances that they're in, and most importantly by keeping the focus on the child and the life that we want these young Australian children to have. Then I think we can galvanise the whole Australian nation to do their bit to see a better future. And I think that's what everyone wants. That's not about being a bully boy, that's about giving a hand up. And if you're taking advice on this, are you satisfied that none of this will be in breach of the Racial Discrimination Act? Well, I don't pretend to be a lawyer, but we've had advice by eminent QCs, the AG's department, and I am totally convinced by that advice that everything we're doing here is within the Constitution and that we have the powers to enact the laws that we've proposed. And it's also within your constitutional powers because of the referendum in 1967, is it not, for you to broaden this out and take action in the states? You don't need to wait on the premiers. Look, I've heard that said twice now. I haven't taken advice on that at this point. I'm acting mostly under Section 122 of the Constitution, which gives the Commonwealth the powers to act in territories. It's an interesting concept that you raise. I have been very disappointed, disgusted, in fact, in New South Wales inaction on its report for the last 9 months. You only have to talk to the leaders in the Cape to know that this is not isolated to the NT. And of course Columbaroo, with 13 males out of an adult population of 90 now being charged in the last 2 months with child sex offences, points the finger right across this nation. It is not just the NT. And I'm hopeful that this will be the bunga underneath some governments to actually act, if you like, in the most decisive manner. They can see the public will support them. There won't be any sort of pushback, but they want genuine engagement and they want a genuine attempt to overcome the problems that these families and these children are really dealing with on a daily basis. Minister, thanks for your time this morning. Thanks, Barry.
It was a pretty flat week, though, in politics. Didn't seem to be big issues until the very end of the week, and then the Prime Minister seemed rushed with his response towards the Indigenous issue.
I think the fact that it came out on the very last day before the winter recess is I think that timing is significant, and I think that kept the focus on the Liberal Party as they went into recess, and that's what people are talking about now.
The points that Mr Howard has made about the non-intervention by other states, all of which I think are Labour governments in those states, is to draw a distinction between himself and those Labour-controlled governments on the issue.
I think the government's focus on the Indigenous abuse as a law and order issue is really quite short-sighted. And I think if they're going to create any kind of meaningful change, they can't put in a simplistic kind of solution that's just punitive. I think they have to be much more proactive.
Is it then a bit of a worry that both parties are effectively saying much the same sort of thing about this?
Well, do you think that might be because this is such an emotional issue? And Kevin Rudd really needed to say, well, yes, we fully support you in this.
The government has done the right thing in intervening. They had to do something about that issue. I think in an election year, people in Canberra do tend to watch what happens in politics a lot more.
But I think John Howard regards every single day as an election day.
Don't you think, though, that there must be a natural shelf life to a government, and we must be approaching it, mustn't we? I think that the government's intervention in Indigenous affairs, in the way in which they've expressed it in the last day or so, goes beyond paternalism to pure racism.
It isn't a time for being point scoring or leadership debates or style or tactics. It's more about let's fix the issue and make sure this doesn't happen, not just in those communities, but other communities around the country as well.
And it's fair to say, Fran Kelly, there's a degree of cynicism creeping into this.
Well, there is, and there always will be, because this government has had a real issue with Indigenous affairs. I mean, John Howard made the sort of attack on ATSIC one of his very first moves when he took over Prime Ministership. So there is, and he wouldn't give an apology and all of that. So he's not coming from a great base of trust with Indigenous Australia. But I think there's no doubting the Prime Minister's genuine desire to do something here. Yes, it will have a positive political impact. I think it will show him as a leader in charge and driving a long-term goal. So, you know, people might want to stick with him to get that done. It gets support from those, you know, who see him as compassionate. It gets support from those who think, well, the blackfellas really need a tough hand being brought to them. So it brings together a few constituencies here. But I think the Prime Minister's driven by a genuine desire. This country, we should be ashamed of this.
And hopefully huge positives in the communities, George, but you would think some positives for the Prime Minister as well.
Genuine he is on this issue, but remember, this is the first time he's set an agenda since Kevin Rudd became leader. I think, for me, one of the most interesting things about the Thursday press conference was he was finally leading on an agenda that he'd dreamt up. Everything that's occurred since Kevin Rudd became leader has been in response to the Labor agenda, and I think on the government side there'll be people who are a little more relaxed now about what the Prime Minister is going to be taking to the election now that he's starting to run on positives.
Yeah, Gerard, Henderson, there was a lot of static through the week, a lot of issues that in retrospect now don't matter so much. This suddenly took over.
Well, it's a big issue, and there may be a degree of cynicism among a library book club in Canberra after John Stanhope himself has said that what John Howard is doing is racist, but I don't think anyone who seriously understands the problem, and including Kevin Rudd, agrees with that. I mean, the reason why it got such prominence is because it's so important. We're not talking about racism here, we're talking about how governments, federal and state, should deal with serious acts of criminality against young defensive Australian citizens.
Well, we'll get some background and analysis now. Paul Kelly is still on assignment in Europe. In his absence, we're joined this morning by Financial Review's Chief Political Correspondent, Laura Tingle. Laura, good morning. Just on the policy, first of all, what do you make of it?
Well, Barry, I think it's a very important initiative by the Prime Minister. Obviously, this has been a crisis for a very long time, and suddenly we're seeing a lot of really positive actions of people saying, right, we can't just muck about here, we've got to do something serious. But there are obviously a lot of issues that are still unresolved. We've just had the Minister talking about stabilising communities, and obviously that's very important. But when you start thinking about the complexities of this, for example, what happens to all the abusers if they're identified? We don't know yet how the government plans to deal with them. Are they going to be excluded? Do they think that if you remove alcohol, somehow sexual abuse is a recreational thing which will disappear? A lot of questions are still unknown, particularly about what happens after the stabilisation phase. Now,
Gerard Henderson referred before to John Stanhope's comments. We'll have a look at those in a moment, but there has been quite a variety of responses from the premiers. First of all, though, I think from the extreme edge of the cynical meter, I think it was John Stanhope, here he is.
What long-term sustainable outcomes are going to be achieved by a process that is inherently racist, that does identify a group of people on the basis of their race, their Aboriginality and the place in which they live?
How do you see the politics unfolding?
Well, as Fran and George have talked about, Barry, there's a very sort of cynical element on both sides of politics about the Prime Minister's motivations in this. They're not coming out at the moment because it is a really serious issue. Kevin Rudd isn't prepared to be wedged on this and is also very concerned about it. But without a doubt, this issue provides the Prime Minister with a lot of opportunities politically. There's division already between the premiers about this. There's uncertainty, as I said, within the Labor Party about elements of this, particularly relating to land tenure. People aren't quite sure why this particular crisis requires the Commonwealth to essentially take over large slabs of the Northern Territory. And I think the interesting politics of this in the next couple of months in the lead up to the election will be the extent to which the debate is fragmented amongst the various policy initiatives, and the question of whether that is able to be successfully separated out from the issues that are more directly related to child protection will determine whether this is a complete political positive for the Prime Minister or whether it is seen in much more cynical terms.
Now, before this issue arose, there was a lot of discussion about the business communities getting involved in advertising on the industrial relations issue in the run-up to the election. They say this is business, not politics.
Well, I think this is a bit cute on that part of the business community. They've publicly been under a lot of pressure from the government to back reforms that they wanted to have in place. The business community is now quite split about whether they're prepared to enter the political game, but without a doubt I think they are now well and truly into the politics of this, particularly by choosing Mark Textor to advise them on the policy.
And for how long do you think Kevin Rudd can go on sacking union bosses for misbehaviour?
This is also a really interesting issue, I think, Barry. I think poor old Kevin Rudd's stuck whichever way he goes on this. If he keeps throwing people out, there won't be anybody left in the Labor Party if it's just about people who swear. But I think he loses out if he throws people out, because people in the union movement and the Labor Party are starting to get a bit shirty about this. But if he doesn't do it, he can get framed by the Prime Minister as supporting union thuggery. And without a doubt, the government is now portraying the unions purely as a bunch of thugs, and any of the positive work that the union movement's done in the last few years to try to soften its image, if you like, on things like James Hardie has really well and truly been lost, I think, in the fray.
Laura Tingle, thank you for that this morning. Appreciate it. And just one point that Laura is making there on, she expects that the arguments will start becoming fragmented. That's the danger, obviously, for Labor, that they find it uncomfortable to deal with some of the issues as they emerge. Is that where the sort of Tampa comparison comes in?
You need to remember what actually happened in Tampa. Kim Beazley agreed with the initial response to the Tampa, and so he was in the border protection tent, so to speak. When the detail of the legislation came out, he decided that Labor couldn't stomach the detail. So he was for it, then against it, and the flip-flop is what defined Beazley in the 2001 election. The Prime Minister would love to get Kevin Rudd on a detail like this. He'd love to get the argument on the fragment, as Laura describes it, because he could then say that Kevin Rudd's not serious about protecting children. Now, I'm not sure that Kevin Rudd is going to fall for it, because history tends not to repeat as specifically as that. Everybody's aware of the Tampa precedent.
So he can't flip-flop now that he's in. He's in for the long haul.
Well, I think we have to be careful about language here. I mean, we have a situation whereas if you sort of agree with someone, they believe, and if you disagree with someone, they wedge. I don't think John Howard's wedging. He happens to firmly believe in the position which he's stating. Now, I think Kevin Rudd firmly believes in the position which he's stating in response. I don't think John Howard is wedging, and I don't think Kevin Rudd has been wedged.
But what if an issue does arise down the track that bothers Kevin Rudd, whether it's a deliberate wedge or not? If an issue arises and it bothers him...
Well, Gerard's right. We have to be more mature to be able to handle disagreement without it being a wedge. But then that comes to the Prime Minister's intention, I think, whether he tries to wedge or he tries to have an open discussion. I think Laura picked the issue that might you know, provide a wedge, and that's land rights and the land title. And the decision to overturn the 1976 land rights legislation for a period, why is that necessary? And if we get to that point, that might be the sharp end of this, I suspect.
And
later.
if bipartisanship is what they're after, and the Prime Minister did describe this as akin to a national emergency, in a national emergency you'd bring the opposition along with you, wouldn't you, before you make the announcement? You'd haul them in, give them the briefing and say, this is what we're doing, what do you think?
Process. This is an interesting question, Barry, because this reminds me a bit, in the haste, even though it's a serious issue and we can't doubt the genuine intent on the government side, this reminds me a bit of the Murray-Darling takeover announced out of the blue in January. Opposition wasn't brought in until they saw the press conference. They made one attempt to contact the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory. Noel Pearson got a call 15 minutes before announcement. This is not a policy that came after serious consultation. But now that they've started it, they need everybody in on it, because Mal Brough talked before the remoteness of people issuing policy on the ground. You can't be more remote than Kirribilli or the Lodge or the Cabinet Room of Canberra. It's not a criticism, it's just a comment that this is a multi-layered issue that probably needs engagement from the grassroots up.
I agree with that. I think it was disgraceful that Clare Martin, the Northern Territory Chief Minister, wasn't standing alongside the Prime Minister for this announcement. Yes, it's all very well to say, oh, she's shilly-shallied, she shows no good intention. She is the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory. This is about taking over the powers of the Northern Territory. She commissioned the report. There is no excuse that another 24 hours would have done anything else about, you know, rescuing Aboriginal people. I mean, 24 hours, it was not going to change the dynamics of this, I don't think, except the political dynamics.
They were motivated on Tuesday and made the announcement on Thursday. That's really what the sequence was.
Yeah, but correct me if I'm wrong. I understand that Clare Martin, who I think has behaved very badly on this issue over a long period, had this report for 8 weeks.
Absolutely.
And hang on, and did not give a copy to the federal government, as I understand it. So where's the responsibility then?
Well, the responsibility, nevertheless. I mean, this is not about tit for tat. This is about a national emergency, right? We all see this report. Clare Martin had it for 8 weeks. Let's ask the Chief Minister why she held on for so long. It seems absolutely shocking. But we all get it on the Friday. What is wrong with the Prime Minister then ringing her up and saying, listen, this is disgraceful, but we've got to do something about this, boom, boom, boom? What is wrong with that?
Clare Martin would regard this as a high priority. An embargoed copy should have gone to the federal government that day.
I'm not arguing with that.
8 weeks ago.
Gerard, don't you think, though, that the problem the government has in terms of perceptions here is because of the way they went about it, that it appears as if they don't want to share the political capital?
Well, governments have to make decisions, and John Howard regards it as an emergency, and I think Kevin Rudd supports him on that. There's a lot of support for this within the Labor Party. Governments have to make decisions. You have a government in the Northern Territory which has delayed making decisions, and why should you go back to a government which has delayed making decisions if you need to make a decision suddenly? I expect that John Howard thought that Labor would come on side. Labor has come on side. I mean, well, he happens to be the Prime Minister, and we are dealing here with children the age of my grandchildren who have been sexually assaulted, primarily by Indigenous men and by some white man at all. I mean, it's not a matter of sort of sitting back and waiting 8 weeks for a report to come and then saying someone's got to come down and stand beside you. I mean, someone's actually got to do something.
OK, we'll be talking to Clare Martin in just a moment, but let's go back to what I think was a very significant interview in all of this, Fran Kelly's interview with Noel Pearson on Radio National during the week. And as we now know, the Prime Minister was listening in and he was certainly impacted by this, along with a lot of other people.
Ask the children. Ask the children if they want some paternalism. Ask the terrified kid huddling in the corner when there's a binge drinking party going down the hall. Ask them if they want a bit of paternalism. Ask them if they want a bit of intervention. Because these people who continue to bleat without looking at the facts, without facing up to the terrible things that are going on in our remote communities. These people are prescribing no intervention. They're prescribing a perpetual hell for our children.
It was a powerful presentation, wasn't it?
It sure was, and I think that image of the children cowering is where everybody comes to the party here. And Gerard's right, this is about little children, and that's why the Prime Minister is getting the support he is. But that's not a reason to chuck away every process. It is a reason to be moving together on this, I think. I'm not saying move slowly. I'm not saying it's any excuse for moving slowly, but I am saying it is an excuse for bringing everybody in.
I think Fran's interview with Noel Pearson was perhaps one of the most important interviews in the last 10 years. A very important interview.
Well, let's get a view now from the government that has to deal with this issue every day of the week. The Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, Clare Martin, joins us now from Darwin. Good morning.
Barry, good morning.
Could you just clarify your position? I understand you're meeting with the Prime Minister on Thursday. Will you be offering him your full cooperation?
Barry, I already have offered the full cooperation. There's a lot of there's a lot of kind of toing and froing about what's happening, and I've listened to your conversation with your panel this morning. Can I just say that in terms of having the report, I got an early draft copy. It was an inquiry, an independent inquiry, and the inquiry determined when that report was released. As soon as it was released, a copy went to the federal government. It was on the net, and we had people coming to Canberra to start those discussions with the federal government. As soon as I got that early copy, what I did was heads of agencies were working on, there were 97 recommendations, and we were looking at their implementation, a lot of them built on the things we were already doing. And I believe that we have moved with those recommendations very promptly. But a key recommendation of our inquiry was that this, in terms of dealing with the issue, was beyond the financial capacity of the Northern Territory, and we had to work in partnership with the federal government. We had put in place that to happen, and then all the Prime Minister's announcement came on Thursday. So I was taken by surprise, but can I just say that we will work on this very serious issue with the federal government. We will work in partnership, we will cooperate, because this is an issue at the heart of Australia.
But you saw how quickly the government can act when it has the will. Do you think you should have done more in that 8-week period?
Well, it actually was only 6 weeks, but we did act, we did a lot of work, and can I just say that the issues that have been raised by the Prime Minister and Minister Brough, I'm delighted. We have raised those issues previously. There's some sense that to have welfare reform wouldn't be accepted by Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people are the ones who raised welfare reform, who wanted to see that link, particularly with the issue of going to school attendance. Aboriginal communities raised it with us to say, have a link between your family benefit and attendance at school. They want tough measures, and they will welcome this. I raised it with Minister Brough 12 months ago and the Prime Minister, and I'm delighted we're finally seeing some action. So I will be incredibly cooperative. I want to see this work.
Clare Martin, in terms of being incredibly cooperative, you've seen the public support come in behind the Prime Minister for acting quickly and unilaterally in the first instance. You say it was the timing of the people holding this inquiry to decide the timing of the release of it. But given that you knew it was beyond the capacity of the Northern Territory coffers to really get the action required, I don't understand why you didn't ring the Indigenous Minister, Mal Brough, and just say, listen, this is where we're at, this is what we've got to do, we need to be ready to go with this, even if you both then agreed to wait for the report to be tabled. Like, why didn't you do that? Because that doesn't seem like an act of good faith.
Fran, as I said, there were 97 recommendations, and they really are about the long term. And if you look at that report, it says that this is a very complex, it's a very serious issue, the protection of our Aboriginal children. And the measures that they recommend are long-term ones. They're to do with education and health.
All the more reason to bring in the Commonwealth partners, surely.
We were looking at what the implications were, and we did that in that time frame. And as soon as the report was released, we're on the way to Canberra to talk about it. Now, I think that's a responsible way to go. I think if you look at our response to this report, it has moved very quickly. And but again, what we have to make sure is that anything that is done now, and listening to your previous discussion, I mean, it would sadden me deeply if this is about wedge politics. This has got to be about long-term solutions, not short-term solutions. And what the Territory wants is practical, effective, workable solutions for the protection of children. And they can only be long-term, only long-term.
Ms Martin, Gerard Henderson here. Can you clarify what happened last Thursday when apparently the Prime Minister's office and the Minister's office tried to contact you and calls weren't returned? Can you just clarify what happened there?
Oh, not at all. I got a call, I think, about 45 minutes, as it turned out, before the Prime Minister was doing, or maybe an hour before he was doing his press conference. I found out later. I had a call that said the Prime Minister would like to talk to me. I was available. I sat at my desk for half an hour, and I had a commitment after that. And to my sadness, because I think this has to be about a partnership, the Prime Minister's office wouldn't tell me what it was about. And so I waited. I waited for that call, and Unfortunately, I wasn't able to talk to him till after he'd done the press conference.
Now, just finally, there's been the suggestion that maybe issues will arise down the track that might fragment the Labor Party. Is there anything that you've heard up until now that disturbs you?
The issues, some of the issues that are raised, Barry, about alcohol in the Northern Territory, about 90% of the Northern Territory is dry. We have some very tough alcohol laws in place, and it concerns me a little about, and you know, I want to see the detail, but it does concern me that some of the kind of measures talked about in alcohol might actually lift some of the tougher restrictions we have on alcohol consumption. The issue of health. Again, the federal government saying that they will bring GPs into the Territory. That's something we've been calling on them to do. I mean, that is their frontline responsibility. And it can't be done on a short term. It must be done on a long term. We have one of the most highly dispersed health services in the country. And we have, you know, nurses over the Territory. We don't have those doctors to match. And simply to say that we can bring doctors in a task force for one health check is simply not going to work in terms of that measure, that prism of a long-term approach to tackling child abuse.
Clare Martin, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, she's raised a couple of issues there that are not exactly in line with the federal government's intentions.
I think for me, Barry, the whole thing is about the paradigm. The PM keeps talking about we've got to get out of the old paradigm, that didn't work, this is a new one. I think that's important that, yes, we've got this leadership here, but all players, including the federal government, need to be more flexible, more open-minded. The hackles need to go down from all sides. I mean, this is a very entrenched debate, as the PM keeps talking about, that hasn't worked. Brough says, let's, you know, stabilise the situation first. Yes, let's do that. But also, let's not shut out the people. I've heard the Prime Minister and the Minister today almost in a sense lay the groundwork for shutting out the old political leadership as we know it, the Mick Dodsons, the Pat Dodsons, the, you know, those kind of people, on the basis that let's not deal with people who are a long way from the action. Well, I think that we need to rethink that. I think we need to not get sort of bogged down in arguments about is this going to be the stolen generation again or not get sort of scared by that, but accept that people from all elements of this want the best end result and allow people into the tent,
but then the
not
debate
shut people out from the tent.
The debate can become very cumbersome and nothing happens.
And that's the whole point. And there's a different group of Aboriginal leaders emerging. Noel Pearson, clearly, Sue Gordon and others who actually, what distinguishes them from some of the others is they actually want to do something and they want to do it now.
Well, I think we heard from Mick Dodson on Friday that he wants to do things too and has always wanted to. I mean, these people aren't, you know, inactive in their lives. I suppose the best example of this I'm saying is let's look at the decision to hold back 50% of the welfare. Noel Pearson's plan was let's do that for people who are causing trouble, for people who are disrespectful to their kids, abusing their kids, people who are drunks, but let's have a commission which includes some of the local elders to do that. The Prime Minister's plan, as I understand it, though it's a bit unclear, is everybody in these communities has 50% of their welfare payments held back. Now, to me, that is wrong and that is paternalistic. And what about the people who are well-behaved, peace-loving, great, you know, community members? Why should they be treated in this way? And shouldn't we have some sort of local... So there is some elements of self-determination in all of this.
There's an interesting question about the... Well, let's take this detail of the 50%. What's the criteria for saying that 50% of the household budget of a low-income earner goes to education necessities? I'd like to see the research because I'd be surprised if it was that high. You might want to do it as a voucher, you might not. I mean, there's a number of issues here. But just on the matter of the Indigenous leadership, the fact that there isn't an articulate and respected Indigenous leadership in Australia for the last 10 years is really something the government has to take responsibility for. Shouting them all down and then reaching a point where practical reconciliation has probably had its day. I think we're now moving to a new phase. You might term it punitive reconciliation. It's actually quite hardcore now, the sorts of things we're talking about. But I would like to see an Indigenous position established because we need an Indigenous leadership to be able to consult with. This has been a structural weakness, not just with this government, because Paul Keating had the same problem with Mabo. He said that he actually had to create one out of nothing. Now, that means that they were all talking to his story. But again, John Howard, you know, sacked ATSIC partly because Mark Latham allowed him to. But I'd like to hear...
There is no longer any system that allows for elected representatives.
But a new generation has emerged. You go back 10 years, the relationship between Noel Pearson and John Howard was poisonous. Noel Pearson appeared at the Sydney Institute just before the '96 election and devoted his whole speech to attacking the Howard opposition as it then was. What happened was, over time, Noel Pearson worked with the government and the government responded. John Howard has made a number of concessions. And with those Indigenous leaders around Australia, and there are many of them, who wanted to do things that the government and the government's ministers, Prime Minister and the ministers, have actually responded. And so you've got the situation now where Noel Pearson seemed to be leading the government, whereas 10 years ago he wasn't talking to John Howard.
Yeah. Still, was only given 15 minutes warning, though.
I'm sorry, George, we need to move on now. On the issue, first of all, that Kevin Rudd again has, well, in the end, not suspended one but three union officials on Thursday, as it turns out, but Joe McDonald, number one among them. Given the nature of the videotape, did he have any choice?
Would have been campaign material otherwise. I mean,
well, it will be anyway.
Yeah, it will be anyway, but
it's really tough because, I mean, union leaders say, well, we're going to be suspended for swearing now. I mean...
But that's the myth, isn't it? That they were suspended surely for intimidation and bullying.
Yeah.
For
yes.
thuggery.
Yeah. I think a bit of a problem in this, I could be wrong, is that the union leadership really needs to be the one presenting a decent face again. I think the point Laura was made was all that work of, you know, James Hardy, etc., it's all disappeared again in this old-fashioned look of the unions. Well, who was that face? It was Greg Combet. Greg Combet's a little out of the mix now, isn't he? Yeah. Because he's standing for Parliament. You know, I think it's
a big problem.
They missed him.
Kevin Rudd's problem is a policy problem. I think he's done the right thing. But whilst the relationship between the trade union movement and the Labor Party is so close, the Labor leader has to act. But he's also got a policy problem lying around because even though he's delayed the abolition of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, which presides over trying to maintain some kind of law and order on these building sites, particularly in Western Australia, whilst Kevin Rudd's delayed the junking of that, he's only delayed it to 2010. I mean, Labor's still committed to getting rid of the only body that can stand up against some of these union thugs on work sites, particularly in Western Australia, but in other states as well.
Unless union leadership stands up to them, is my point.
Yes, but getting rid of it, but replacing it with something else, but the detail of that is yet to be announced. Now, we've all seen the news grabs of Joe McDonald, the bullying and the intimidation, and no doubt we'll see it again in advertising form. There was a lighter side to it, though. Here's part of it.
I'm asking you to leave the site.
We'll get
Please take
the
notice and leave the site.
You just get at the front.
You don't have right of entry permit here, Joe. You don't have
We've got a union meeting. We walk off the job and we have the meeting under that cover out there. All right, brothers? Don't be intimidated. He's too fat, he's too small, he's too old. They're all they're you understand me? Small, fat and old. Too old, too small, too fat.
You're a year older than me, Joe. I'm from the ABC.
I don't give a fiddler's I don't know who you are, little man.
What's that? Little man? You're not much bigger than me, mate.
They were claiming that Joe's both older and fatter than they are.
All of the above, I think.
I think Joe McDonald thinks thin. But the other point that he made there, which showed some of the snobbery among some of these trade union leaders, not all of them, some of them, he's having to go at people who work with Hungry Jacks. What's wrong with someone working as an employee with Hungry Jacks? What's wrong with
exactly.
I think the wages might be a little less.
Presumably they don't have coverage there. Barry, I'm still struggling with this idea that somehow if Kevin Rudd becomes Prime Minister, we're going to be taken back to the 70s. Trade unions cover less than 20% of the total workforce. There are a couple of areas of monopoly power. The CFMEU's got one of them on building sites, but nobody's been able to demonstrate that the housing boom has somehow been curtailed by the thuggery of the building union. They're making a lot of money like everybody else at the moment.
But the whole concept of the Labor policy is a re-regulation which will increase union coverage. I mean, it has declined. Labor's policy actually will bring about a situation where not trade union membership, but trade union coverage will increase. That's the whole point of the policy.
But how far are we taking it back? I mean, it was already declining well under the Paul Keating's and the Hawke-Keating era. It was already well in freefall by then.
The fact that it was actually declining faster.
To pattern bargaining? This is the point Labor needs to nail down.
No, but you're confusing 2 points. There's one issue is trade union membership. The other issue is trade union coverage. You could have 90% trade union coverage with 15% trade union membership. What we're talking, the key issue here has always been coverage. Even when trade unions had 50% of the workforce in members, they had 95% of coverage. This is an issue of union privilege, and if you put it, it's come out of the legislation. If you put it back into the legislation, coverage will increase again.
We're fast running out of time with the employers now, and was it an error in judgment to take on Crosby Textor, given their links for their advertising campaign?
Yes.
Given their links with the Liberal Party?
Definitely. And the Prime Minister had an interesting point he was trying to make, that apparently Mark Textor hasn't shown him the polling he's done for the business community, but he's polling the same electorate, so presumably the government is well and truly aware of what the business community
There's no argument about the business community and their entitlement to advertise, and probably the nature of it will be, I think, restricted to the nature of the legislation. It won't be proactive in a political sense. But the Labor Party managed to portray it in that light.
Well, the business community is very divided on this issue, and I mean, some of the most significant figures in taking this debate up for the business community, like Heather Riddart, her group is not in the advertising campaign, so you can just see how they're divided as to the propriety and appropriateness and how it can be done. I think they'll probably sort something out, but it's not surprising that business community is divided. That's its nature.
I think they've bought themselves a fight they didn't need to. I think you're absolutely right. When the BCA and others have funded ads before, they've been pretty straight up and down. They haven't been political animals, but somehow they're enmeshed now in this political fight. They've been politicised when for so long they try not to be that.
Now, we'll go to talking pictures in just a moment, but before we do, Kevin Rudd got into a bit of trouble this week on the productivity paper that the staff had prepared for him. He mislaid it and then accused that when the Australian got hold of it, he said this is a stolen document. Well, this is how it unfolded, and you'll see very early on in the piece that he actually puts the document down on a desk.
Okay.
Cappuccino? Come on, Kevin.
Hi, I'm Gerard.
Andrew. And Corwin. That's great. Now, I need... You do cappuccino? Hey, Lemmy's. Did someone pick up my stuff? Yeah, my paper's in there. Okay.
And it turns out that the document stayed on the table for some time, got mixed up with students' papers, and then...
How did it end up in the government's hands?
Well, it must have been another copy. I mean, isn't that the suggestion that...
Might have leaked from somewhere else.
Yeah. And the leak,
see.
in fact, in the end, had nothing to do with what we just saw there. Fran, Kelly, George, Megalogenis and Gerard Henderson will be back in a few minutes, but time now for Talking Pictures. Mike Bowers is taking a break for a week. Standing in for him is Fiona Katauskas.
Hi, I'm freelance cartoonist Fiona Katauskas, filling in for Mike Bowers. And this morning I'm talking pictures with Newspole CEO Martin O'Shannessy. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you, Fiona.
Newspole's been around for 22 years, so do the cartoons go back that far?
They certainly do, and some of them, of course, are a bit old for people to remember, except people my age.
Oh, you're not that old. Well, here's an old one, an oldie and a goldie.
This is one of my favourites because it's very gentle on the people in it, but it says something absolutely important about the political system that I grew up with, which was in the days of Joh Bjelke-Petersen as Premier of Queensland.
The polls put you at 31%.
By golly, I could win an election with that.
Now, this week's Newspoll had Labor out in front again. The AC Nielsen poll result was quite similar with the ALP on 57%. And the Sydney Morning Herald's Alan Moyer came up with this.
I think that captures just that moment where everybody's frantically doing something to somebody and we need to spend a little bit of time and interpret. And I like that about cartoons. They can actually take you in and get you thinking about what's happening. The characterisations are a bit cruel, aren't they?
And here's one from a couple of weeks ago that you got personally from Bill Leake, which shows the poll for the fortnight before.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. None of us could really explain how, after getting a thorough pizzling over a lot of issues, the ALP vote stayed up and stayed up and stayed up, and gravity just wasn't having any effect. So Bill's got in here in the ring. The judge's decision is that on points, Rudd's still ahead, even though he's battered and bruised.
Another news poll released on Tuesday in The Australian showed that 52% of Australians have locked in their decision. They've decided who they want to vote for. Did that surprise you?
Absolutely. It's not normal for people to have made a firm commitment to vote so far out from an election. However, polls are polls. Things can change, and in particular this one here.
Yes, well, this brings us to this lovely cartoon.
Everything old is new again. Here we have a cartoon by Nicholson in 1997. And the picture is a beautiful sunny summer beach, people on their summer holiday, and poor old John Howard is the only person on the beach being hit by the wave, which is labelled opinion polls.
Kim Beazley here. I want to fight Howard, not Costello. And then he reads the polls. What I meant was Costello, not Howard. And I think that's what every opposition leader's thought over the last 10 years, most probably.
He's seen quite a few come and go, hasn't he?
Well, we've got a fair bit of political history in this room, going back to Mark Latham as well.
When Mark Latham was opposition leader, he had this tremendous, bright, honeymoon period. Very high ratings, and then they quickly faded away. So quickly, we have a dead parrot which bears a striking resemblance to the opposition leader, upside down, a Norwegian blue, I think, from the Monty Python skit. Should we get the dead parrot stuffed? And he's, the other person holding the news poll is saying, oh, I think he's pretty stuffed already. Some of them can be a bit cruel, and I don't think in a nasty way, but they really get to the point.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And we have another cartoon that's gotten very nicely to the point in a way that only Bill Lee can.
What we have here is Mark Latham sitting with a baby on his lap, and this is at the time when he was promoting that we could improve society generally by everybody reading to their kids.
Yeah.
Which, you know, great idea, but it got a fair bit of a poo-pooing along the way as well. So what we have is the child having the news poll snatched away from him, and Mark Latham saying, "You're not reading that, it'll give you nightmares."
And it gave him some nightmares too.
That's right, this is towards the end of the reign.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on Talking Pictures this morning, Martin. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks for showing us the fantastic news poll collection.
My pleasure.
And George, Martin's observation there about the rusted-on Labor vote, that's new.
Yeah, it's pretty high at the moment. In fact, Labor have got more people sticking with them than at the previous two elections. And that would be a worry for the government. I mean, we asked the question in this particular news poll, are you likely to change your vote between now and the election? And there was a smaller proportion at this point in the cycle than occurred in 04 and in 01. Now, bear in mind that the headlines out of the polls all this week were roughly the same. The government still a mile behind.
Now, the politicians are a mile in front in terms of their pay rises. Now, let's not go into a debate about whether or not they deserve the income that they receive. They probably do. But this 6.7% increase, why 6.7? Why twice the rate of inflation?
And how do we ever know why? I mean,
there's no transparency.
And that's the problem. It was the size of it. If it had been 3%, even 4%, it would be within the realms of what, for heaven's sake, unions might be winning for their people. But, yeah, what most of us are getting. But 6.7%.
If we'd still had a centralised system, obviously, that 6.7 would have gone straight through the economy and the Reserve Bank would have gone nuts. It's actually above, 6.7 is actually above their comfort zone for wage settlements.
I don't think comparative wage justice ever applied to politicians, but I think there's been a policy over time to increase salaries, and bear in mind a lot of politicians are getting a lot less than a lot of journalists and media commentators.
Absolutely, that's why I wasn't arguing with the bottom line. And now, but Senator Sue Boyce, the Liberal Party senator from Queensland, had this response when it was put to her at the doors during the week.
Do you think it's good news that pollies are getting a pay rise?
I'll probably buy some extra pearls and ask before the disturbing poor or something, hey?
Not the most tactful contribution.
Senator Boyce should learn you don't crack jokes. I mean, it was a stupid thing to say.
OK, but Malcolm Turnbull cracked a joke in the Parliament during the week. It's not Peter Costello's domain. On his own, he will make water an issue no matter what.
Take this front page of the Gold Coast Bulletin. There it is. Dam drips. These men got us into the drought mess. And who are these smiling creatures here? Kevin Rudd, Wayne Swan and Peter Garrett. Just as our water policies are determined to make every drop count, to make us efficient in our use of water, to make every drop count,
member for Greenlow.
So must we make every drip accountable. And there they sit. Drip 1, drip 2, drip 3.
That's very good.
No, it wasn't bad. Now, Senator Bill Heffernan, there's a report this morning that he phoned up the manager of Cubby Station. He has a running battle with Cubby Station, posing as an ASIO agent, asked him a few questions, including questions about their perception of Bill Heffernan. He also phoned a constituent and had a 20-minute conversation pretending to be Senator Barnaby Joyce, and one of his questions was, what do you think of Bill Heffernan?
Completely wacky. Rein him in. If not illegal, rein this man in.
Well, Bill wants a drug test for politicians. I think we should start with psychological testing for politicians.
Good point. OK, final observation or prediction, Fran Kelly?
Oh, look, it's been a huge week. I just think my prediction is that if we are going to really put in the resources, the counselling resources, the health resources, the education resources needed to get this Aboriginal problem right, we're going to be beyond the $10 billion realm that the Prime Minister's already promised for water.
Prime Minister's agenda setting, expect Kevin Rudd to come out with a positive announcement in the next couple of weeks. I think we've ended the sort of nasty name-calling phase of the election campaign, and we might be in a bit more policy content, hopefully.
When this period of Australian history is written, Noel Pearson will emerge as one of the most important practical thinkers of his time.
And I hope there is no videotape of those Australian sailors swearing at the Iranians, otherwise Kevin Rudd will want a court-martial. And that's it for this week. I'll be back with Offsiders at 10:30, and now coming up next, Ellen Collar and Inside.